Hey everybody, and welcome back to Submarine History. Today we're going to start a series of briefings on the history of torpedoes. In today's brief, we'll talk about the historical development of torpedoes from the 14th century to the end of the U.S. Civil War in 1865. Read the description to this briefing. It has relevant related references and links. I have a Discord as well, and there's an invitation link on the channel banner. If you like the briefing, you can leave a super thanks or consider a channel membership. Your donation helps offset the cost of purchasing books, professional memberships, and software needed to write and record the briefings you've come to enjoy and appreciate. Finally, thank you to the United States Naval Institute for all they do preserving and promoting world naval history. If you have any questions about the briefing, leave them in the comment section below, and I'll do my best to answer your questions. Okay, let's do this. Torpedo. This comes from the Latin word torpedo, meaning lethargy or sluggishness. And sorry, I don't know how to pronounce it in Latin. The first known use of the word torpedo is for a genus of electric rays. They are slow-moving bottom dwellers capable of delivering an electric shock to stiffen or paralyze a victim, so aptly named. David Bushnell is credited with using the word torpedo for the first time to describe the explosive charge his submarine Turtle carried. And it would make sense to use that word, as Turtle was a slow-moving vehicle designed to deliver a shock to an enemy vessel from below. Robert Fulton, who knew David Bushnell, took the word torpedo from him and applied it to a family of sea mines he designed and demonstrated for the British and American navies. So the very first torpedoes weren't what we consider today a torpedo to actually be. Those early torpedoes, going all the way back to the 14th century China, were actually floating sea mines. It's around 1900 that the word torpedo begins to be used specifically for underwater, self-propelled ranged weapons we understand today as torpedoes. So to simplify the discussion today, we're just going to refer to these historical weapons as sea mines. Now, way back then, the typical sea mine was a wooden, watertight barrel or box packed with gunpowder. There would be some way of igniting that gunpowder, and ignition could come from an external fuse that burned down over a period of time, or there could be a mechanical device inside the sea mine that, when struck hard enough against a ship, would release a spring-loaded flint mechanism to spark and ignite the powder. This illustration is from the 14th century military tristy, the Hulong Jin. And in this illustration, this sea mine was called the Submarine Dragon King. The firing mechanism consists of a floated incense stick, which lights the fuse when it burns down. The fuse, contained in a length of goat's intestine, was connected to the explosive charge, which was submerged. So when you think about this, what were some of the potential problems that had to be overcome for a sea mine to be successful? Well, you had to be upstream of your enemy in somewhat protected waters, and that could be a river, bay, or harbor. This way the sea mine could float down to the target carried by the current or tide. If you were using a fuse device, then you had to do some math to make sure the fuse was long enough to make it to your target. If you used a mechanical device to generate a spark, you had to be careful not to blow yourself up when you set the sea mine in the water and pulled the safety pin. So in the case of the Chinese, these sea mines were used as harassment devices against Japanese pirates, generally unsuccessful. Oh, and by the way, you probably wanted to do this at night so your enemy wouldn't spot your sea mines and maneuver away from them. Now, according to the U.S. Navy Heritage and History Command, the earliest known use of sea mines dates to 1585 during the 80 Years' War. Antwerp had been under siege from the Spanish from July 1584 to August of 1585. Part of the Spanish siege included building a bridge across the Scheldt River in Antwerp to block Dutch access to the open sea. In April of 1585, the Dutch, trying to break the siege, packed 2 ships with gunpowder and steered them into the bridge, or estacade. Estacade it's French for pier or pile. Sorry, I probably didn't pronounce it right. And if you put these piers or piles close enough together on your bridge, it can act as a physical barrier to ships while letting the water pass through. Okay, and that's what they did. One ship missed the bridge when it ran aground, but the other one came to rest against the bridge where it exploded and partially damaged it. A success from the standpoint that the Dutch demonstrated the ability to guide and steer a sea mine, but not so practical because it takes a long time to build ships and they're expensive. You're also dealing with the question of how to safely disembark the crew before the ship goes boom. Fast forwarding to 1775, and we have American patriot David Bushnell and Turtle. Bushnell was studying at Yale in 1775 when he showed that gunpowder could be exploded underwater. Apparently, he didn't have a copy of the Hulong Jin on hand. He worked with a clockmaker to develop a clockwork and flintlock firing mechanism to trigger a time-delayed fuse for an explosive charge. Having designed a sea mine, the next step was to build a delivery vehicle for it. That was Turtle, and here it is. You can see on the back of it a wooden keg filled with 150 pounds of black powder. That's the sea mine. This is the first attempt to use a submarine to deliver a sea mine to a target, and it's a cheap solution, small and discreet, that risks just one person. And I'm sure that everyone involved with that project realized that Turtle and its torpedo represented, for the first time, the high reward potential of a system like this. Turtle's mission was to attack ships by attaching its sea mine to the bottom of their hulls, using a hand-powered drill and ship auger bit to penetrate the hulls. Turtle tried unsuccessfully to attach its sea mine to HMS Eagle on September 7, 1776. Turtle was again used unsuccessfully on October 5, 1776, and then it was lost on October 9th when a sloop, serving as Turtle's tender and carrying it, was sunk by British warships on the Hudson River near Manhattan. It was realized by the Americans that this idea of a human-powered submersible delivering an explosive device to a target was a lot more complicated than they first thought. But what they decided they could do was float a bunch of Bushnell sea mines down the Delaware River where the British had a fleet at anchor. And the Americans did that on January 6, 1778. So it seems that Bushnell finally found a copy of the Hulong Jin. Now this attack was referred to as the Battle of the Kegs, and it was largely unsuccessful. However, it did put the British in a defensive posture, and one Bushnell mine did eventually destroy a tender to HMS Cerberus in Black Point Bay in New London, Connecticut. And it was becoming clear now that sea mines were an option of last resort, at least until the issue of delivery and guidance could be solved. Robert Fulton would be the man to try to solve those problems. He was an American engineer and inventor living in France in the 1790s, and he'd been working on a submarine design, Nautilus. He pitched his submarine design to the French in 1800 and got permission to build and demonstrate it for possible purchase. This is Nautilus. Part of its design was a towed sea mine designed by Fulton himself. It was envisioned that Nautilus would approach the broadside of a ship at anchor where, as it passed under the hull, and that's yellow on the slide, a device on top of the conning tower would drive a spiked eye into the wooden hull. Having done that, a sea mine, and that's blue on the slide, was released on a line that went through the eye. As Nautilus moved away from the ship, the line attached to the sea mine would pay out until the sea mine struck the hull. At that moment, a flintlock detonator inside the sea mine would trigger and explode a black powder charge. Fulton successfully demonstrated this concept on a 40-foot sloop provided by the French, but ultimately they decided against funding the project, partly out of distrust of Fulton himself, partly out of a resistance to change, and partly out of a perceived danger to the crew using Nautilus. Fulton, fed up with the French, he moved to England in 1804, where he offered his services to the British Navy, and they accepted. This would lead to Fulton beginning the design of a second Nautilus for the British, and this also resulted in him designing a series of sea mines, or generically infernal devices, as the British called them, that could be used to stop a French invasion fleet that was under construction at Boulogne. For a planned night raid against Boulogne on October 2, 1804, Fulton chose to use sea mines constructed from 40-gallon casks. These casks would float on the surface and were packed with black powder and incendiary bomblets. intending to explode and damage a ship's hull as well as rain down burning bomblets on nearby ships. How would Fulton make sure these sight mines would hit their target? For the planned raid, a pair of mines tied together would be placed on the bow and stern of a low-profile catamaran, crewed by 8 sailors and a coxswain. And again, this is being done at night. Now in this picture, we have a ship at anchor. The anchor chain B is highlighted in yellow, just so it's clear, and we understand the ship is pointed in the direction from which the water comes. Under darkness, the catamaran would pass the bow of the ship, dropping one mine on the starboard side of the ship and the other mine on the port side. The rope connecting the floating mines would get caught on the anchor chain as the mines floated down past the ship, causing each mine to be pushed up against the hull of the ship, where they would explode on contact or after a time delay. In the upper right-hand corner of the slide, there's a detail of the mine. The explosive-filled cask is the lower component. You can see a capped flange on the right side. That's where the detonator was inserted. And the upper square component is cork, sized to make sure the mine was a little positively buoyant, okay, so it would float on the surface. Now, that raid was unsuccessful, and a follow-up raid on December 8th failed as well. Okay, but finally, on October 1st, 1805, the British were successful and secured hits against 2 French ships using catamarans, but no visible damage was done to them. Fulton thought about the problem for a while, and he concluded that it wasn't enough for the mines to explode against the side of the hull at the waterline. The mine had to detonate near or under the keel for maximum damage. He redesigned his sea mine, or torpedo, so when carried by the tide or current, it would push against and down under a ship's hull. These illustrations are from Torpedo War and Submarine Explosions. This was a military book written by Fulton in 1810. And this book outlined his ideas on warfare using torpedoes from design to implementation. In the illustration on the left, we can see our sea mine, lower left-hand corner, with its cork float. This time the cork is sized so that the mine is a little bit negatively buoyant instead of positive. Okay, so it's going to sink. There's a line attached to the mine that goes to the surface where it's attached to a large piece of cork that is very buoyant. So think of a fishing where you have a bobber on the surface and a weighted lure suspended below in the water. That's what we got here. Our mine and its surface float tied together are in turn connected to another line that is attached to a harpoon on a rowboat. So this time we're going to shoot that harpoon into the bow of the ship, and we'll just cast over the side the mine and the surface float. As we drop our mine system into the water and it's carried to the hull of the ship, a safety pin is automatically pulled to start the clockwork detonator. The line connecting the mine to the surface float is long enough that the mine will come to rest under the hull as the current pushes it. And that's the illustration on the right, and you can see mine B underwater and how the current would push it up and under the hull to position F, so kind of a pendulum effect at work. Fulton successfully demonstrated this concept of a keel detonation on October 15, 1805 against a British brig, Dorothea. Fulton used one mine packed with 180 pounds of black powder. The explosion lifted Dorothea 6 feet upward and broke the ship in 2 halves, which sank quickly. This was the first time in history a ship was sunk with a mine, and at that moment you can imagine all Fulton saw was the sky raining down gold on him. But, as luck would have it, with Napoleon's feat at Trafalgar on October 21st, 1805, 6 days later, the British no longer needed Fulton's infernal weapons. So Fulton would then return to the U.S. in 1806, where he and Robert Livingston would design and build the North River Steamboat, the first commercially successful passenger steamboat. He wrote his book in 1810, and then during the War of 1812, he designed a spar torpedo for the U.S. Navy to use against the British. And he was working on the design of a steam-powered battery, a floating battery for the U.S. Navy when he tragically died at the age of 49 in 1815. I'm including this slide. It's an illustration from Fulton's book that shows his idea for an anchored sea mine. Okay, finally, something we actually think of when you say sea mine. It's just a weight to keep the system in place and the previously developed floating cask with the sufficient amount of cork to make it buoyant, and with a couple contact arms to trigger the detonator. Fulton proposed laying hundreds of these mines with 15-day fuses in narrow channels to either stop an enemy outright or slow them down enough to allow engagement while the enemy slowly maneuvered through the mines or tried to clear a path. Now, there would be no further significant use or development of sea mines until the American Civil War. On the night of February 17, 1864, the Confederate-operated H.L. Hunley successfully attached a spar-mounted torpedo into the hull of USS Housatonic below the waterline, where it detonated and sank the ship. And this is the first time in history a submarine successfully sank a ship in combat. Both the Union and Confederate navies used these spar torpedoes with surface ships. Hunley is just the compelling submarine example of their use. I could go into more detail, but I'm not going to go into more detail about the Hunley in this briefing. It's a lot to go over, and I covered it in other briefings, but I will put links in the description below to the other briefings on the Hunley and early U.S. submarines, so you can dive a little deeper, pun intended, with those briefings. And that's it for today's briefing. That's about 500 years of history in 20 minutes. We started the briefing dropping barrels into the water with the hope the current might carry them to victory with a lucky roll of the dice. And we end it with purpose-built explosive devices with mechanically controlled detonators able to be precisely placed on a ship's hull by human-piloted delivery vehicles. Yeah, this was a really challenging subject to cover. It was new to me. I've never really taken an in-depth look at the subject of torpedoes before. I mean, outside of things like the Mark 14 torpedo, you know. But I learned a lot, and I hope you enjoyed it and learned something too. Leave your questions and comments below. Oh yeah, come to the Submarine History Discord and say hi. Till next time, peace out.